Sure. Let me. Um, yeah, I'm going to stop this and try again. There. I think that's working. Good morning. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak to your class again. It's always a pleasure. I've done this for a number of years now. It's great to meet you. I might, before we get going, would it be possible just to get everyone to introduce themselves so that I know who is in
I can request them to introduce themselves in chat if that's okay with you, Mr. Cook.
Sure, that would be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, so go ahead. You all can introduce yourself in chat. Just type your name, organization, or the class.
Just to introduce myself, my name is Derek Cook. I work, I serve as the director of the Canadian Poverty Institute. We're located at Ambrose University here in Calgary, which is located on Treaty 7 territory. And it's a privilege to be here. What I would like to do today, and I hope this is what you were hoping that I would do, Manisha, is just talk a little bit about poverty and how we understand poverty, and then looking at some of the roots of poverty, and then what are some things that can be done if we're interested in reducing or ideally eradicating poverty. So that's what I had planned to do. To begin, we're talking about poverty. Obviously, a good place to begin is to define what it is we're talking about. So I'm curious, and we can either do this in the chat, or if you would like to speak up. I'm wondering what words you would use to describe poverty. So say somebody, maybe we finally made contact with extraterrestrials who landed on Earth, and they've heard this word poverty. I say, what is this thing called poverty that you're talking about? What words would you use to describe it? Not much money, not good food, no shelter or home, not good clothes. Other things, what do people online think? A place to shower, so there's hygiene, no friends, no work, right? Other things? It's a good place to start. Lack of resources from monetary to emotional. So it's the suggestion here is that it's not just about money, but there's something more to this condition of poverty than that. Anybody else? Last thoughts? Isolated, depending on shelters, no connection, or socialism, not well dressed or part of society. Yeah. Struggling to buy food. So I see a lot of what we're talking about here when we talk about poverty. We're starting with this understanding that we're having difficulty meeting our basic needs in some way: food, shelter, clothing, hygiene, all of those things. And this is one way of thinking about poverty. And it's what we sometimes call an exclusive understanding of poverty, which means that when we're thinking about poverty in this way, we're really thinking about the lack of money or material resources. So we're focused really narrowly on those economic concerns about poverty. So if we were to define poverty in this way, we say that you are in poverty if you don't have those things that you need to survive. So those basic fundamental human needs. So I guess the question, and maybe you started to answer this in the words you use, but what is essential for survival? What are those basic things that we need in order to simply live? Again, feel free to speak or pop it in the chat. What is it that we're talking about? What's essential for survival? Food. Yep, number one. Can't live without food. Air, right? Clean air, I'd say. Good sleep. Shower, friends, family, home. Water, and again, clean water. Good health, to be able to walk. Anything else? Shelter. Yep, the basics, right? Food, air, water, shelter, things related, our health, related to our biological functioning and our biological survival. So this is one way to think about poverty, and it's actually the way we typically tend to measure poverty. So when we're thinking about poverty, the question is, well, who is in poverty? Who's lacking that? Well, how do we know? We need some way to measure that. So we have in Canada, we recently adopted this measure of poverty. This is the official measure of poverty. It's something called the market basket measure, where the Statistics Canada has made a big long list of all the things that they think are essential for survival, and they've put a price to them. And they say, if you can survive, if you can afford this basket of goods and services, then you are not poor. But if you can't, then you are. So you might think about, you're going into the grocery store and you've got a shopping list and you put all those things in your cart, you get to the till. If you've got enough money to pay for it, then you're good. If you don't, and you have to start putting things back, then we say that you're in poverty. So any guesses on what the amount of money is that we need to survive? So we're thinking right now about a family of 4. So we've got 2 parents, 2 children. Any guesses on how much money you would need? What's the cost of buying the things you need in order to survive? Pop your guesses in the chat. Sorry, a year. How much a year? So as you say, 2,000 a month, I presume, so 24,000 a year for a family of 4. Others? At least 20,000. Yep. Any other guesses? Well, this might shock you. In Alberta, in Edmonton, for a family of 4 to buy the basket of goods and services that say is sort of essential for you to live, $55,000, and in rural Alberta, it's 52,000. Now, this gets to the question of what exactly do we mean by essential for survival? I think part of this is reflecting very high shelter costs. We've also seen rapidly increasing food costs and so on. But in this market basket measure that Statistics Canada has developed, they've also included other things besides food and shelter and clothing. Included, for example, the cost of a cell phone, the cost of modest recreational activities, the cost of they're trying to remember some of the other things that are in the basket. Would you say that those are essential for survival? Cell phones, transportation, you're saying, yes, they are essential for survival? Transportation, especially in rural Alberta, yeah, cell phones. In today's world, they are, right? What about recreation? Cost of, going out to a movie once a month or something. And yeah, internet, yeah. Do we think that going out to a movie is essential for survival? Gwendolyn, you're saying sometimes? Or yes? So when we start to think about these other things, I say, well, what does it mean to actually survive as a human being? It's more than just our biological functioning, right? That it's also got to do with, right, mental health, relaxation, connections to other people, right? And when we start to think about it that way, it starts to broaden our understanding of what does it mean to be in poverty. And so another way of thinking about it is in a broader perspective, which we call a more inclusive understanding of poverty, which says that it's not just about, your material conditions and whether you've got food and water and so on, but there are also a lot of non-material aspects to poverty too. This definition says it's a multifaceted phenomenon comprising a dense network of material and non-material losses, denials, privations, hardships, and disadvantages. Just looking at the chat here, some of these privations that we're talking about, I see you're putting them in the chat here, no downtime, you get overloaded. There's cultural poverty, language poverty, no identity, can't participate in cultural activities. This is central to what it means to be human, isn't it? So in this understanding, a person is poor, say if they're disadvantaged compared to others in such a way that it compromises their dignity and their ability to participate in social life. So this is not just about your absolute level of living conditions, but it is about where you fall on the spectrum of society. And if everybody else has a cell phone and they are able to go out and socialize and do these things, and you don't. You may have shelter, you may have food, but you're still not able to participate in social life. So we say that that's a relative form of poverty. Or you may have shelter and food, but it's not dignified shelter. It's not food is not being provided in a dignified manner. That also is constitutive of poverty. So we've started to answer this question in the chat, but what is it that compromises a person's dignity and their ability to participate in society? What do you think? What are some things that would maybe be measures of poverty if we looked at it from that way? No respect. Others? Our dignity, our ability to participate. What would prevent us or compromise our dignity? Debt, yeah. Court orders for maintenance. Anything else? Belonging or maybe lack of belonging, I'm thinking. Addictions. So these are all additional elements to poverty. Now, it's difficult, supports, yeah. Difficult to measure that stuff, right? We can't, it's hard to measure your sense of belonging and so on. So many people still rely on an income definition to get at that, and we can do that for the longest time. In Canada, we used something called the low income cutoff amount, which is different from the market basket measure because it doesn't say how much do you need to buy this basket of goods and services. It says, where do you fall on the income ladder relative to other people in society? And they figured they did that by measuring how much you spend on basic needs and how much you have left over. So this is something called the low income cutoff amount. And it said the poor households are those that are spending 20 percentage points more than the average on basic goods and services, food, shelter, clothing, and so on. So you may have all of those things, but you're spending so much of your money on them that you don't have the ability to do much else. So that limits your ability to participate in society. Now, interestingly, when we look at the dollar amount, this was different from what I was expecting. In Edmonton, so this is lower than when we add up that basket of goods and services from the market basket measure. But in Edmonton, they say about $43,000 is the cutoff for a family of four, right? And in rural Alberta, it's $28,000. So somewhat different amounts. So this matters because the way we measure it will determine how many people, are in poverty or not. So we've got different understandings of poverty, different ways of measuring it. Recently, though, these are all kind of academic measures, relies on statistics, and it's a little far removed from the experience of poverty. So some people have said, well, if we really want to understand poverty, and this is not rocket science, they said, we should go and ask people who are living in poverty, what is the experience of poverty? So this is kind of the third way we've come to understand poverty, which is what we call subjective poverty, which is we let people who are experiencing poverty define it themselves. What is that experience? Over many years now, I've had the opportunity to speak with many people who are struggling in conditions of poverty. And we've had these conversations. I want to share with you just a few of those voices, which gives us a deeper picture of what poverty is beyond just sort of a sterile number and income number that we use to determine who's in or not. First voice I'm trying to share with you, this person says poverty is misplaced, unheard, unseen, uncounted, noisy, dark. Darkness sets in and you're stuck in a circle, disconnected from the world. Judged, no money, no job, run down, tired, hungry, lack of confidence, foggy brain, can't think straight with no food or money, tired. Emptiness, destitute, hopelessness, helplessness, sadness, darkness, lost. No identity, no self-esteem, coldness, ashamed, no voice, no family, no grandchildren, no smiles, no privacy, no laughter, no happiness. This is what living in poverty means. It's interesting when you listen to those voices, and I've done this in countless situations. Invariably, what comes to the fore is actually not money. That's not the central aspect to it. It's you see in these voices this profound sense of disconnection, lack of belonging, voicelessness, powerlessness, right? I had the opportunity a number of years ago of having a conversation with some people who were living in the mustard seed here in Calgary. You're familiar with the mustard seed, they provide shelter space for people experiencing homelessness. This is part of our work to develop a poverty strategy for Calgary. So we wanted to know if we're developing a poverty strategy, then what would be important to people who are experiencing, in this case, really the deepest form of material deprivation. So we wanted to know what is the most important thing that's impacting your life. And these are people, living rough on the street. I was expecting to hear about the experience of hunger, lack of shelter, all of that stuff. And the number one thing they said to me was, it's my lack of rights, my lack of dignity, my lack of rights. This is more central to them than the material things. So I like to look at lack of money as a symptom of poverty, not as what defines poverty itself. A few years ago as well, we worked with some folks who were living in the mustard seed or precariously housed. We were doing some work with them, training to give them the knowledge and skills to be effective advocates for themselves. So we were talking a lot about poverty, and I asked them to define it. We had, I think, about 10 or 12 people there. So split them into two groups. So come up with a definition of poverty for me. What is this thing called poverty from your experience? And this is what they came back with. The first group came back and said, poverty is a system of oppression based on a group of factors which determines our socioeconomic status. So a couple things here in this definition is, one, it's a system. First of all, the system is oppressive. And the socioeconomic status is being determined by others, by this system. So there's this sense of powerlessness, that things are happening to people that they don't have control over. Second group came back with this definition. They said, poverty is a lack of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Not having the resources necessary to live as everyone else in society or to compete fairly with them. So a few interesting things in this definition is it's not only the material, the physical piece, but it's also mental and social well-being. So it's about resources, not having the resources necessary to live as everyone else in society. This is the relative piece of poverty, right? It's where we are relative to others, or to compete fairly with them. So once again, we've got this sense of unfairness, injustice, that things are out of our control, right? So not to necessarily not be able to compete, but to compete fairly because the system is stacked against us. So this is what this group of people who were sort of mired in the experience of poverty at this point in their life, this is how they defined it. So this really challenges our income definitions where we say, you are earning $55,000 or less and you're in poverty, but if you're earning $56,000, magically you're not. It's a much more nuanced experience than that. And then for another perspective on it, I know this was one of the questions, Manisha, that you said somebody had posed prior to the session this morning about an Indigenous understanding of poverty. I'm to answer that, which I don't feel myself in a position to do, but I'm going to rely on a couple of pieces. One is purely anecdotal, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but I do trust the source. I am told that in the Inuktitut language, there is no word for poverty. There is only, the only concept that comes close to it is a lack of community, to be outside of community. So if anybody can verify that or correct that, please do, but I think it's an important idea. The other perspective I will bring to this is work that we did, again, when I was working on developing a poverty strategy for the city of Calgary. We engaged a tremendous woman by the name of Genevieve Fox, Dr. Genevieve Fox, to lead the development of the Indigenous strategy within our larger poverty reduction strategy. And she came up with a model of poverty reduction, which I think is a model of poverty reduction, also speaks to the elements of poverty. This is specifically from a Blackfoot perspective. But this is the model that she came up with. So the elements, if we're from in this model, ending poverty focuses on certainly on the economic aspect. So economic well-being is critical, but there are also other dimensions to it too. So political well-being is important, spiritual and cultural well-being, and then social well-being. So if we look at this model of ending poverty, we can also say, well, that also tells us something about our understanding of what poverty is, which is deficits in these dimensions. So certainly there's an economic deficit, but also a political deficit. This is the sense of powerlessness and empowerment. Spiritual and cultural well-being, when we are spiritually and culturally impoverished, that is central to the experience of poverty. And social well-being, which I think speaks to that anecdote that I mentioned about the lack of a word for poverty in the Inuktitut language. That when we are poor, when we are disconnected from community, which really comes out strongly. I think all of these dimensions come out strongly in those voices of poverty that we were hearing. And then lastly, in 2018, the government of Canada developed a national poverty strategy. And once again, if we want to understand, if we want to have a strategy to end poverty, we need to know what the heck it is. So they came up with this definition here. The official definition of poverty in Canada is the condition of a person who's deprived of the resources, means, choices, and power necessary to acquire and maintain a basic level of living standards, and to facilitate integration and participation in society. So here again, we see that it is about resources, but it's also about choice. It's about power. It's about integration and participation in society, being connected to society. So going through these different definitions and understandings, we could see that poverty is not just or even primarily about a lack of money. That's certainly an element of it. At the Canadian Poverty Institute, there we understand and we speak about poverty as a multidimensional condition that has these three aspects. One certainly is the material aspect. As I say, poverty is about more than the money, but it's always about the money. So that's critical. And when I say money, not purely about monetary well-being, but it's about access to material or financial resources, which in a capitalist society involves money, but in other cultures and contexts may not. But do we have those material things that we need to survive? Food, shelter, clothing, all of that stuff. But equally, there's a social dimension, which is the degree to which we're connected into a community of people, because that is where we find resilience. And then the third dimension here is spiritual poverty. And by spiritual poverty, I don't mean any particular faith tradition or religious life, although that can be part of it for people, but it's about having meaning and purpose in life. When we lack meaning and purpose in life, that's when we are experiencing that spiritual poverty. So we can see here that the deepest form of poverty is where these three things converge, where we're experiencing material deprivation, we're disconnected from community, and we don't have any sense of meaning or purpose to our life. So just quickly, material poverty then. So it's in our context, it's usually involves income, because that's what we need typically to get the things we need to survive. And we typically do that through work. And if we don't have that, that's where we experience some basic needs challenges, housing instability or homelessness, food insecurity, and so on. Material poverty. Social poverty, certainly the sense of isolation or loneliness. And that's what we hear so much when people describe the experience of poverty. It's being isolated, or worse, being invisible, just unseen. It's about a lack of belonging, feeling you don't fit in anywhere. You don't have a community. It also involves access to supports and services. It involves questions of powerlessness. When we're in conditions of deprivation like this, one of the casualties of that tends to be trust. We don't trust people. We don't trust institutions. And it could also be the lack of information. We don't, without information, we are powerlessness. The information, they say, is power, right? That's social poverty. And then spiritual poverty is certainly that lack of meaning or purpose in life. I don't know if people are familiar with the book. There's a book called Man's Search for Meaning, written by a fellow by the name of Viktor Frankl, who suffered in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. I think he was in Auschwitz. And he talks about how those who could no longer find any sense of meaning in their suffering quickly succumbed to the conditions around them. But from his work and other work that people have done around resilience, people can suffer through tremendous conditions if they're able to be able to make meaning out of it. So when we lack meaning or purpose, that's sort of the deepest spiritual poverty. It also involves lack of dignity, lack of rights, and ultimately, all of these things contribute to a lack of hope. So we have these three dimensions to poverty. There's the material, of course, but there's also that social dimension and the spiritual dimension too. So we might say, well, given all this, how many people are poor? Here's the good news. If we look at Canada, poverty rates have actually been trending down for quite a long time. They peaked in the mid-90s, almost about 20%. One in five people in Canada in the mid-90s was living in poverty, down to about 7.5% now. A similar pattern in Alberta. Early 90s peaked 21%. Again, but 1 in 5 people in Alberta living in poverty, now down to about 7% today. So we've made tremendous progress on poverty. So we need to recognize that. That's a good news story. But we also want to think about the depth of poverty. So we think about this dotted line as the poverty line. We've got a large group of people, this is Alberta, who are living with incomes just below the poverty line. And they may work themselves out of poverty and then fall back into poverty and out in a cycle. But then we have a group of people, about a third of those who are living in poverty are in deep poverty. They are living on incomes that are less than half of the poverty line. But equally important, I think, is this here, the at-risk, that almost as many people living below the poverty line are living with incomes just above it. So if the poverty line in Edmonton is $55,000, if you're earning $56,000, technically you're not in poverty, but you may be up here at risk. And that has consequences too. If we're living with that constant stress, I saw a figure recently that said about half of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. Right? So pretty hard to feel secure, and that creates stress. And then we also have to look at who is it that is experiencing poverty, because it's not everybody, right? And here we're starting to look at some of the systemic aspects to it. Why is it that recent immigrants, lone parents, persons living alone, Indigenous persons, racialized persons, tend to have significantly higher poverty rates than others? So this is where we have to start to ask, well, where does poverty come from? What's the underlying cause of poverty? And there's two ways that we can think about that. For the longest time, we said, well, it's the result of the individual, right? There's something wrong with the person, right? So poverty is due to, they have a bunch of different explanations. At one point, they said it's biology, that people who are poor are biologically different from those who aren't, and that persisted for a while. Was quite quickly debunked by good research back in the 1960s. That actually no, there's actually no biological difference. But then people said, well, maybe there's a culture of poverty. There are people who are in poverty are living in cultures that lack certain characteristics that will get them out of poverty. So I talked about cultural deficiencies, and this has probably been the explanation that's persisted for the longest time, sort of throughout history, is that there are moral deficiencies. So this is, people are poor because they're lazy, or they have some character flaw, right? So this is the individualistic perspective. But it doesn't really hold water, especially when we start looking at those disparities between different population groups. Why is it that certain population groups have higher rates of poverty? Certainly, it can't all be due to cultural or moral deficiency. There's something else going on. There's nothing that predisposes a person to poverty. So this is a societal perspective, which we say there's nothing inherent in the individual that would lead them to poverty. They are in poverty because they exist within a particular cultural, economic, and political context. So here we say that poverty is due not to deficiencies in the individual, but to systemic barriers and to the social political environment that they are in. So where does poverty come from? So there's a number of factors. Certainly there is an individual component to it, but equally important, where we are in the life stage matters. Our social connections matter, and systems matter. So these are all dimensions of vulnerability that leave us more or less vulnerable to poverty, depending on these different factors. So if we go through them, the individual factors do matter. So things like education, skills, language ability, we suffer from addictions or have a criminal record. All of this stuff certainly is important. The problem is this is usually where we start and stop with explaining poverty. And when we focus on this stuff, that gets us to those individualistic explanations. And it's easy then to say, well, you know, these are things that are a matter of choice. And we might also, that might lead us to blame people, say, oh, you know, you made a bad choice, so it's your fault. So when we stop here, that's the danger. But we have to understand these individual factors as they are interconnected with these other things, like where we are in the life stage. So when we are at ages where we're in greater stages of dependence in life, either as children, youth, or as seniors, we're more likely to be in poverty. But also families with children. Statistically, simply having kids increases your risk of poverty. I'm not sure what the causal relationship is there, but those with children, families with children, have higher poverty rates than those without. Or if you're in a position of caregiving, maybe to elderly parents or to someone with a disability or a child, you are at greater risk of poverty. But then our social connections matter too. This is that social aspect. So when we're isolated, we're more vulnerable. When we live in disadvantaged neighborhoods, we tend to be more vulnerable. When we don't feel safe in our neighborhood or in our home, those who are living alone and disconnected, in particular lone parent families, more vulnerable to poverty. And statistically, if we move, people who move have higher poverty rates than those who don't. Probably because when we move, it disrupts our social connections, particularly for those who've moved from other countries. And then lastly, there's a systemic piece. So systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination. There's the impact of colonization, patriarchy that disempowers women, our economic structure. There's rules and regulations that don't work well, keep people in poverty or even lead them into poverty. Lack of social protection, what we've done to our social safety net. All of this stuff increases our vulnerability to poverty. So when we have multiple of these going on, then we become highly vulnerable. And this might be the group of people that's at risk of poverty, right? Not in poverty now, but holding it together. But we've got all these vulnerabilities, and we can hold it together until something happens. And then what might be an inconvenience for some, for those who have multiple vulnerabilities, it becomes a crisis and a spiral into poverty. And so that could be many things. It could be you get sick or develop a disability. Family breakdown is a quick route into poverty for many people, particularly women. Job loss. So somebody loses a job. Maybe you're relying on two incomes in the family, and one of those income earners loses a job. There's a death in the family. Unexpected expenses. The car breaks down. We don't have money to replace it, and you need the car to get to work. or natural disasters, fires, floods. In Calgary, we had a hailstorm about 4 years ago that devastated the northeast part of the city. We did some work in that community understanding the impact of it, and I found it had actually led one family into homelessness. So these are all the shocks that can impact us more or less depending on these different vulnerabilities that we have. And what is the impact of poverty? Poverty has profound impacts in so many different ways. It affects our physical health. It's associated with higher risk of acute and chronic disease, and ultimately reduced life expectancy. It affects our mental health, stress, anxiety, depression, all related to poverty. Addictions, so substance use disorder, it's a mental health condition. And I would suggest that for many people, this is a coping mechanism for poverty, more so than it is a reason for poverty. Often we say, well, somebody's poor because, you know, they suffer from addiction. I would say in many cases, poverty is a result of something else, and people are using substances in order to cope with the experience of poverty. There are cognitive effects, so reduced concentration, functioning, and decision-making. When we think about it, we talk about the importance of people making good choices. Like you need to make good choices or better choices. We're asking them to do that precisely when they're least able to make good decisions, because poverty actually affects our cognitive function. For children, it affects their affects them developmentally, so impaired social and cognitive development. Isolation. So poverty is both a cause and isolation is both a cause and a result of poverty. Those who are more isolated are at greater risk of poverty, but when we're in poverty, we tend to isolate ourselves. So we have reduced access to the supports that we need in order to stay out of or get out of poverty. Trauma, once again, trauma is both a cause and an effect of poverty. So if we've experienced trauma, that's a vulnerability that can lead us into poverty. But also poverty, somebody said to me once in one of these conversations I had, that poverty itself is a trauma, right? And one of the impacts of trauma is disrupted relationships. So that's what we need the most, right? Is we need those relationships, the social connection. And that's the very thing that poverty disrupts. And then it affects our dignity and our sense of self-efficacy, that we are in control of our life. And it can be related to the stigma that's imposed on people because of poverty, and it can lead to a condition of learned helplessness. There's no point in trying, because as we saw in those definitions at the beginning, the system is stacked against me. I can't compete fairly with others. It's a system of oppression. I don't have control over the things that are affecting me in my life. One of the other impacts of poverty and trauma is reduced trust. So strategic trust is our experience of trust with another person. I don't trust you because you did something, you broke my trust at some point in time. So these are disrupted relationships. We don't trust other people. But at a larger level, it also leads us to say that people in general can't be trusted. So even though I don't know you, I'm still not going to trust you, and I'm not going to trust the institutions that are there, because I don't believe that they can help me or that they have my best interest at heart. Attacks our trust, which impacts what we call social cohesion, the ability of the community to work together. We end up in these polarized camps where we don't talk to each other, which means we can't work together precisely when we need to work together the most. And all of this also has an economic cost. We talk about, well, it's too expensive to end poverty. Well, actually, yes, ending poverty has a cost, but we forget that keeping the people in poverty is also expensive. Estimate from a number of years ago now, so this is probably low, says that poverty costs the Canadian economy $86 billion annually. So there's a cost to it. So lastly, what do we do about poverty? Very quickly. Historically, we've had a few responses to it. One is we blame the poor. It's your fault. And because it's your fault, I'm not obligated to do anything about it because you got yourself into this mess. You pick yourself up by the bootstraps and get yourself out. That's the individualistic view of it. A more charitable view is historically we've also provided charity. So we give to the poor, but even here we tend to distinguish them between those who are deserving of it. That is, we can see that they're poor by no fault of their own, versus these guys up here that we blame, who we say, well, they're deserving, you know, they deserve to be in poverty because it's some fault of their own. So we'll only give to those who we think it's, you know, they deserve our charity because it's not their fault. Well, more recently we've said, well, from an individualistic perspective, if there's things about an individual that are leading them into poverty, then we can fix that. If it's education, we can give people education. If it's addictions, we can cure their addictions, and we fix the poor. Or here, when we look at it more societally, we say, well, maybe we need to fix the system. We need to fix those things that are putting people into poverty or putting them at risk of poverty. And then lastly, we can try to build community, which is building those social supports and connections around people that will help them to be resilient. And I think this combination, I think probably with the exception of number one, blame the poor, probably all of these responses have a place, right? But if we just give to people without fixing any of this other stuff, you're not really doing anything. You're just putting a Band-Aid on it. If we give people education, we don't fix the system that they're embedded in, the systems of economic exploitation and so on. You haven't really done anything for people. If we do all of this stuff, but we don't build community around people, then it's kind of hollow as well. So I'm just about out of time here. Thank you for your patience. I want to share with you one last thing though on building community. This is from a great mentor of mine who I greatly admire. He wrote this book called Deepening Community. I just want to read this one passage and then leave you with this as a thought. In the beginning of the book, he says, people often ask him, what's the most important thing people can do to make a difference in the world? That's simple, I almost always reply. Bring chicken soup to your neighbor. Really? Is the typical response. I say yes, and then add, but remember, I said the answer is simple. But the act of bringing soup, well, that takes work. It requires you to know your neighbor. It requires that you know that they are not vegetarian and like soup. It requires that you know them well enough and communicate regularly enough to know they're sick. Once you know they're sick, you must feel compelled to want to help and to make this a priority among the many calls on your time and energy. And your neighbor must know you well enough to feel comfortable in receiving your help. And you have enough of a relationship to know what they prefer when they're sick, whether it's chicken soup, pho, chana masala, or even ice cream. So you see, the work takes place long before you perform the act of bringing soup. And I think that brings us about to the end of our time together. But thank you for listening. And if people have some